Hello and welcome. My name is Jeremy Glover and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our latest Fenwick Elliott webinar, the final one before we take a short break before the summer. And today we're looking at climate change and the role of legislation, case law, contracts and technology, in particular in the UK's journey towards net zero. What are the key factors in enabling change? And it's a timely topic as it's just 87 days before COP26 starts in Glasgow. COP26 is the United Nations Climate Change Conference, although COP itself simply means Conference of the Parties. And I'm joined by two experts in the field, Dr. Stacy Sinclair, who leads Fenwick Elliott's Technology and Innovation Initiatives, overseeing the development and implementation of new legal technologies, as well as collaborating and engaging with clients on the use of the new digital technologies in the construction industry. And Ruth Keating, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers. Ruth has a keen interest in environmental law, and she's the editor of the Sweeten Maxwell Environmental Law Bulletins. She's also co-authored with Nigel Plemming QC the chapter on climate change litigation in the United Kingdom in the recently published book, Climate Change Litigation, Global Perspectives. So just a reminder to you all, you're all on mute, but please do send in any questions. We'll try and deal with those at the end of this webinar. And you'll be able to find the slides on our website later in the week. A link will be also put in the chat during the webinar. But Ruth, if you'd like to start us off with something about legislation and an update on policy.
That's great, Jeremy. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. So I'll be going through some of the key legislative updates that we're seeing coming down the line, and also policy updates, all of which relate to climate change and net zero, but also are going to very much impact any construction projects coming down the line. So looking first at the kind of key updates that we're going to see, and they really fall under two headings. The first is existing legislation and building control documents. Now, I'll go through them, but we do already have some key documents in the industry, such as approved document L, which relates to net zero. But we're going to see a lot more of those, and I'll be looking at some of those examples. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the Environment Bill. Now, if any of you have been following it with keen interest as it made its long passage through the bill, we might finally have a resolution to this bill becoming an act, and that will probably be in the autumn, so it's certainly becoming relevant. And finally, what the impact of all of this is going to be on the construction industry moving forward. The key point to look at there on your screens is the existing legislation. Now, there's lots more that I could have picked, but in many ways, these three are the drivers behind the net zero landscape that we see in the UK. The first that I'll go to there, because it's really historical, is the EU flag and the influence of EU law in terms of net zero. Now, of course, a lot of that law has been retained, but moving forward, we're going to see the possibility for a lot more movement and divergence between what the EU does and, of course, what the UK does domestically, and therefore the impact on UK domestic construction projects. You'll also see there, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, well known to all of us. It was ratified in 2016 by the UK, and what that aims to do is limit the increases in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. And of course, to do that, it set a 2050 target, and that is to have a net zero carbon economy by 2050. And finally, an important point to go through there is the Climate Change Act 2008. It's a domestic piece of legislation. Of course, that will be updated and changed in the years to come. What that effectively does is it commits the UK to cut emissions by 80% by 2050 from 1990 levels, and it also provides for a carbon budgeting mechanism. So we're now in our third carbon budget for the UK, 2018 to 2022, and we'll enter that next phase soon. When we're talking about all the changes that are coming into place and the exciting technologies that can help us, I think these 3 points really set the stage for the net zero drive in the UK. But of course, there's going to be lots of changes coming down the line. And one of the big ones, I think, is going to be in terms of approved documents. So there's an example there on your screens. It's approved document L, and it relates to the conservation of fuel and power. Now, what that effectively does is relate to Regulation 26 of the building regulations, and that states that where a building is erected, it shall not exceed the target carbon dioxide emissions rate for the building. And approved document L, of course, provides helpful practical advice on how that can be implemented, and how a design stage calculation can be carried out. Now, many of our listeners will already be aware of approved document L and how it's implemented in practice. But I think what's important to keep in mind as an example is that this was amended in 2013, crazy to think almost a decade ago, given all of the changes that have happened since then. Minor amendments were made in 2016. And I think some of our listeners are probably thinking, if we're going to have this new net zero carbon neutral economy, there's probably going to be lots of changes coming to approved document L. And those listeners will be right. There's been lots of criticisms that when you look at approved document L and the requirements it sets in terms of carbon emissions, it doesn't seem to quite tally with what we see in the Climate Change Act. And it certainly wouldn't lead us to reaching net zero by 2050. Now, the relevance is that it also relates to the government's roadmap towards a new future home standard in 2025. And what that is going to do is it's going to mean that all new homes will need to reduce emissions by at least 75%, and the use of fossil fuel heating will be banned. So that would really be quite revolutionary, and would also represent a kind of sea change in terms of the requirements on developers and construction projects and subcontractors. You see there the final point, interim uplift standards. Now, I think when we hear about changes coming down the line, particularly when there's so much legislation around COVID and lots of busy policy making, we think, well, maybe it might be a couple of years before things like approved document L are changed. That's certainly not the case. It's becoming a real priority. And the second point, of course, is that there's proposals for interim uplifts to the standards in the meantime. So very much something that people in the construction industry are going to have to think about now, because if they have construction projects in the pipeline or they're applying for development plans and all those kind of things, they're going to have to think about how they're going to have to fulfill these new 2021, 2022 requirements rather than the slightly more generous ones that we previously had. Now, looking at the next slide there, we have some calming leaves for you all to look at for the Environment Bill before we move into some of the perhaps more stressful changes that are going to come in. In terms of a background to the bill, the primary purpose of the bill, of course, is that, as we've already discussed, a lot of the law in this area originally came from EU law. So really the Environment Bill is plugging that hole that we've lost from the CJU and the Commission. But it's doing lots of other things as well. What it's really doing is offering, in some cases, a fundamental rethink of how environment and planning has operated in the UK. And the impact of that is that there's a very strong trickle-down effect for the construction industry, both in terms of what funders are going to be looking for when they fund a project, in terms of what developers are going to have to put forward, and therefore very clearly the kind of building that's going to have to ultimately be built. So there's a snapshot there in front of you. Now, we can't go through, and some of you might be relieved, all of the provisions of the bill. It's a 272-page document. There's 145 clauses and there's schedules as well. So it's hefty enough in terms of its content. But naturally, some parts are more or less relevant to the construction industry. So looking on your screens there, you'll see environmental principles and go into those, target provisions, and they're going to relate to 4 priority areas. So the government is going to have to set targets for 4 priority areas, and they're going to be in the areas of air quality, water, biodiversity, and also resource efficiency and waste reduction. So very clearly things that are going to mean that once the bill has come in and become an act, we're going to see policies that are relevant to the construction industry. Biodiversity conservation covenants will come to those, air quality and water, all things that can very clearly relate to the construction of a building. So if you look at the environmental principles there in front of you, in case anyone needed persuading that they very much have the construction industry in their eye line. If we look at what is now clause 17, because they keep updating the numbers, what's going to happen is that the Secretary of State is going to have to create a policy statement on environmental principles. Now, those environmental principles originally came from EU law. They've been integrated into the domestic legal framework, but they all very much relate to construction. Now, some of them that come to mind of the 5 would be the need to prevent or avert environmental damage. Of course, that's relevant to construction. Priority that any damage be rectified at source, and finally the polluter pays principle. So all very relevant. But I think giving us the real sounding gun that they are looking at the construction industry is what the Secretary of State needs to be satisfied of when he or she approves that policy statement. And they only need to be satisfied of 2 things: that it's going to contribute to the improvement of environmental protection, of course, and the final point that they're going to have to be satisfied that it contributes to sustainable development. So looking at that, along with some of the comments that have been made by the Climate Change Committee, that construction is a huge part of the UK's carbon footprint, it's fair to say that this is something which is going to be very much in the eye line of policymakers in years to come. Now, in terms of who's going to oversee all this, what the bill is doing is it's creating the OEP, and it's a new, as you see there, world-leading independent environmental watchdog. It sounds very exciting. I think we'll see in practice how separate that might be from government, or how the policies are set. But certainly what it will do is really take over some of the enforcement procedures that we have lost through EU law. And something for everyone in the industry to really keep an eye on is that it's not yet clear, of course, how the OEP is going to operate. Will they do something like proactively review certain areas of law, or are they going to be reactive and respond to issues which are raised to them? But certainly, given the construction industry's involvement and contribution to the carbon footprint of the UK, I think it will be unsurprising if we saw some of the OEP's involvement in the area. We now come to really two of the key points that I think everyone in the construction industry is going to have to get used first to what all the language is around this. So in their first meeting, when these points are raised, they're not surprised, and certainly how they're going to work in practice. So you'll see on your screens there conservation covenants and biodiversity. They're two different parts of the bill, but they very much tie together. So first, what is a conservation covenant? It's a voluntary but legally binding written agreement between a landowner and a designated responsible body. So that would be something like a public authority or anyone that has any kind of conservation purpose. The point of conservation covenants is that they're meant to bind successors in title. It's going to be very relevant to developers. So if you're buying a plot of land and there's a conservation covenant on it, it's going to bind the land when you build on it. And you're going to have to be mindful of the ways in which that might restrict the project which you are developing, or the ways in which you might have to, in limited cases, perhaps apply to modify or amend a conservation covenant. But the primary position is going to be that it's going to have to be worked with. Some people sometimes ask, well, what's going to happen if you breach one? And of course, it's relevant for a construction project because there's a host of remedies that can be afforded, things like an injunction, but of course, damages as well. And so that's going to be something that's going to have to be communicated all the way down the subcontractor line. So if you're responsible for a project, you don't end up inadvertently breaching a conservation covenant. Now, you might wonder, looking at it, who's going to use these? What's going to be the practical import of them? And for me, where this really becomes relevant is in terms of biodiversity net gain. One of the biggest things that this bill does is that it introduces a mandatory condition for most developments, with some exceptions, to achieve a 10% biodiversity net gain in order to proceed. So before, whereas there were multiple different remedies or methods that a local authority might use to try and encourage biodiversity, it didn't have anything as consistent as this. There also was nothing as rigid as this. So very much biodiversity is going to have to be inbuilt into the construction and design of a project from the beginning. Now, there might be certain projects, and some people might be thinking, well, I don't see how we're going to introduce biodiversity into this project. We can't rewild the whole area. There are limited options what you can do. You can have off-site options. You can either develop off-site biodiversity options, or you can buy biodiversity credits from the government. But the primary position, it seems at this stage, is that they're going to want some biodiversity development on site. And unless you can prove that biodiversity net gain, and that's going to be proved using the government's tool, there'll be difficulties in getting approval for that project. And so something very much to keep in mind. And if there's any designers listening or architects, certainly something that's going to have to be worked into the fabric of the building or the landscape design of the building. Now, looking at this finally in terms of all of this, what does this mean for the construction industry? As I've said there, this is very much something which is on the government's policy agenda. The Committee on Climate Change has called for the construction industry to be largely decarbonised by 2040. That really isn't a lot of time, certainly in the grand scheme of how much development has happened for centuries to try fix all of the loss of biodiversity that has happened. So it's certainly a heavy burden to shoulder now. But when one looks at that fact there, that the built environment contributes to around 40% of the carbon footprint, it's certainly an area that lots of people are going to be looking at, lots of change to approved documents, and of course, lots of changes from the Environment Bill, which will filter down into construction projects. If you wanted some hope of how can you do this, if you're listening, there are some really good examples. So there's Highways England have already pledged to reduce their carbon emissions, and they've lots of interesting projects, notably one of their major projects in Cumbria at the moment, which has used different solutions to reduce carbon emissions by 40%. And finally, there we had the Scottish example of the Granton waterfront regeneration, which is a net zero housing development. So if you feel like you're coming into a project and you need to reduce carbon emissions to fit with all of these policy changes, there are some great people who've done some interesting things before you that you can look at. Lots of work also being done by RICS on carbon reporting, so it's certainly something that other professional bodies are going to be looking at as well. And finally, in case we need any more encouragement, on the next slide there, you'll see in front of you the Environmental Audit Committee is launching an inquiry. They're going to be looking at lots of different things like the fabric of the building and ways that developers and funders can be incentivized to net zero. But I think the line that really sticks out at me there is when it says, for decades we've been constructing homes and buildings with concrete and steel with little thought to the carbon footprint involved. So I think, unfortunately, that little bit of thinking and thought is going to have to fall on this generation of lawyers and builders and architects and construction professionals. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Jeremy, who's going to bring us through some of the case law. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ruth. So yes, I'm going to have a quick look at legal action against governments and also companies relating to, well, I suppose it's fair to say, relating to the climate crisis. I think it's safe to say that generally the legal action, the number of cases, it's increasing in number, it's increasing in scope, and also increasing in ambition. I mean, there have been a number of cases across Europe. You'll see in Netherlands, Germany, France, Ireland and Belgium. And typically these cases are brought on behalf of a large number of citizens by environmental NGOs. But what's happening is that the courts are finding that the governments owe obligations to take measures against climate change. And they're also finding that governments have failed in this obligation. There was a Dutch case in December 2019, case brought by Agenda, and the Dutch Supreme Court found that the state had a legal duty of care based on international human rights principles to take sufficient action to address climate change. By not doing so, the Supreme Court said, there was a risk of irreversible changes to the worldwide ecosystems and the livability of the planet. And with that, there was a serious risk to current generations of citizens, and that might lead to loss of life or disruption of family life. And the state had a duty to protect against that. Now, in Holland, the court went as far to specify what the Dutch state's legal obligation was in terms of cutting emissions. In Germany, in May this year, after the German Constitutional Court declared that the current climate protection measures set out by the government were insufficient, rather than the court actually setting out what should be done, the German government simply changed and quickened the process, set forward new targets to reduce emissions. They reacted to what the courts were saying. And so you can see that the courts are either ordering governments to take stronger climate change measures, or their actions are prompting the government to take those measures. In Ireland, it's slightly different. The Supreme Court found that the government policies were, I think they termed them excessively vague or aspirational. And so the government had to go back to the drawing board and revise its national plan. And I think one thing that is worth doing, as there are an increasing number of court cases, is to keep an eye on what's going on. Maybe sort of look at one or two of the environmental websites. A caseforearth.com is a good example. It's actually run by a former construction lawyer, and they keep an eye on the cases so you can actually see what's actually happening. But these are cases largely against governments, but they're not exclusively against governments. There's a second case in the Netherlands, a case brought by NGOs and Dutch citizens against Shell. And they allege that Shell was threatening human rights, again by reference to the European Convention on Human Rights, by not reducing emissions sufficiently. And the court agreed. They agreed that Shell owed a duty of care to the Dutch citizens to reduce the emissions. And they said, although Shell had a climate policy, that policy itself wasn't good enough. It wasn't concrete. It was full of conditions. They were expecting Shell as a company to take action. And that court actually ordered that Shell, by means of its policy, should be aiming to, or should, reduce its carbon emissions by 2030. And so again, you've got an example there of a court actually ordering a company to take action. Now, Shell have said that they are going to appeal against that. But if you look at the sort of comment taken from the Shell press release, they're talking about the importance of global collaborative action. Now, cynics might say, well, that's an attempt to shift responsibility away from companies to governments. But I think, as particularly as sort of Ruth has already been outlining, the governments are going to be pushing those obligations on the companies, and it's important to keep up to date to understand what the various government legislation is. And as Ruth has also said, there's going to be differing legislations across different legislative approaches across Europe, particularly as a result of Brexit. So I think also there's a need to think about the enablers of change. If companies don't act, then what? And we'll look on that in a minute. But I think what we're seeing, and I think the Dutch case, what it actually does is providing a template for attaching climate obligations to companies. It's providing a benchmark for climate policies. I mean, using as a benchmark, for example, the Paris Agreement that Ruth referred to. And it's also, you've got examples now, the courts requiring action. And it may be that the targets are not going to be the sort of, as I say, the construction companies. Most of the major environmental issues, I think you can attribute them to a small number of issues. You've got plastic, or deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and it may be that the focus is major corporations such as Shell. But there is scope to use the Dutch decisions and to apply these decisions widely. If you look at the European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 2 and 8 cover the right to life and the right to private and family life. So I think what we're seeing, the cases across Europe, they're providing a starting point for establishing climate obligations based on human rights. It may be that it's more for countries that have civil law jurisdictions, but these cases aren't just happening in Europe. They're not just happening where the countries with civil law and civil codes. There's an Australian case this year which ruled that the Environment Minister had a duty of care to young Australians not to exacerbate climate change. Now, the Australian case, as far as I know, is unique in finding a general common law duty of care to avoid contributing to climate change. But in theory, these findings could be applied in other common law jurisdictions. So what about the UK? Well, there have been a variety of court cases, and there's been a variety of court cases. Now, Ruth's already said, we've got the 2008 Climate Change Act, and that was passed, I think, with overwhelming support from politicians, environmental groups and businesses, and it set levels for what the government should be establishing. And it also established an independent advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change, responsible for implementing the framework. But the Act was actually amended 2019 in part against the backdrop of the Extinction Rebellion protests, and the picture is a picture of the Polly Higgins, a ship that was parked outside the High Courts of Justice in July 2019 as part of the various protests that were going on, and then for a while found itself outside the Greenwich Maritime Museum, which is where the photo was taken. But the Climate Change Act was amended to increase the targets in the UK, and the UK was the first major economy to commit to a net zero target by 2050. So moving forward in terms of government legislation, but the UK cases are going slightly differently, and it might be because of the nature of the cases. The Heathrow Airport case and the Secretary of State for Transport case, they're planning cases, they're judicial review cases. But the Supreme Court in the Heathrow case said that the Paris Agreement did not impose an obligation on a state to adopt a binding domestic target to ensure that objectives of the agreement were met. And that led Mr. Justice Holgate just a couple of weeks ago in the Transport Action Network case to say that the Secretary of State, as far as when considering policy objectives, the Paris Agreement wasn't to be considered a material consideration, which gave the Secretary of State a greater discretion. And so it's a slightly different road that those cases are travelling down. But that said, the Plan B case, I think that's something to keep an eye on. It's a much more obvious attempt to replicate the litigation that's been going on across Europe. And as you can see, it's very, very early stage in proceedings, only sort of got underway in May of this year. But I think the other thing that from a UK perspective you need to keep an eye on, Ruth was saying that the government very much has the construction industry in their eye line. And I think that's very true. the Construction Minister, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, has listed 3 government actions to ensure that contractors are committing to reducing carbon contributions. And I think that's quite important, because one of the important limitations on some of the cases that I've been talking about, it's, well, if a state or corporation doesn't meet its revised emissions targets, well, so what from a court point of view? In the French case, the penalty for not meeting the obligations was effectively a symbolic euro. But the government here have got a telling approach and examples of the way forward. They're going to try and use procurement as a means to encourage construction companies and all companies to look to commit to reducing carbon contributions. Companies without net zero plans are going to be barred from bidding for public sector work. Public sector buyers must consider how their procurement can tackle climate change, and central government departments have got to expressly evaluate environmental, social and economic benefits during the procurement process. And on the 21st of July, Anne-Marie Trevelyan noted that it's likely going forward, government tenders will place greater emphasis on climate change. The government's made it very clear that whole life value rather than upfront cost is key, and carbon impact is a critical element in assessing broader value. So very much you can see that the government is going to be looking to use procurement tender conditions in trying to bring forward and promote and ensure that companies are adopting appropriate measures to help bring about net zero. So it's something to keep a very close eye on, I think. And legislation, it's a key driver in bringing about change and helping to promote the road to net zero. And change is going to happen, and what matters is what is enabling or bringing that change about. And the current enabler of change is a mix of legislation, as Ruth has been talking about, and it's also technology, which Stacy is about to talk about. But I think the wild card in all of this is the effect of not just public opinion, but also what's going on in the courts, in the cases that are in the courts. Something more difficult to predict, but something I think it's well worth keeping a close eye on. And with that, I'll pass on to Stacy, who's going to look at the technological side of all this.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. I will come on to a almost similar slide that Jeremy just left off on. So you just heard that legislation, case law, procurement, all of these are really essential drivers to enable this change that we're facing. And what I want to move on to is there are other issues, there are other things that are going to help with this. And I'm going to refer to now the contractual obligations and technology that also are going to need to drive this. There we go. Now, before I move on, I hope it goes without saying that it's not just legislation, case law, and contractual obligations and technology that's going to assist with this. Those are, in our view, certainly fundamental and critical. But net zero, it's an unprecedented, game-changing situation that we're in here, and therefore it's going to take a matrix of enablers to achieve this. So we are looking at, of course, behavioral change, mindsets, collaboration, innovation. All of this together is going to need to come together to drive us towards achieving these targets that Ruth has been speaking of. Now, there we go. First, let me focus on the contractual obligation side and get into a tiny bit of detail here. I think it's fair to say that at least in some sectors, the contractual landscape in respect of net zero and climate change obligations is immature. However, a big however, this is rapidly changing, and contracting parties need to be alive to what they're signing up to. And I think we can expect to see an increase in these contractual obligations in your appointments, in your building contracts, supply agreements, and so forth. And these obligations, as you've just heard from Jeremy and Ruth, they're going to start right at the outset of your project, including planning, procurement, design, construction, operation, commissioning, the whole life cycle of an asset or project. Now, to demonstrate just how much momentum we're seeing on this front in terms of contractual obligations, for those of you who are not already aware, I just wanted to bring to your attention something called the Chancery Lane Project. And I think it's a great example of where we're seeing these contractual obligations and what people are starting to talk about and try to incorporate in their contracts. The Chancery Lane Project, it's a collaborative effort of lawyers from around the world who've come together to develop new contract clauses and model laws to help climate change. It's comprised of about 200 participating organizations and about 750 individual legal professionals. So they've come together to propose draft clauses, they're peer reviewed, and then these clauses are published. They're freely available on their website for public use. Now, these clauses, they don't just cover construction issues, but there's clearly also planning, but also corporate, commercial, insurance clauses, and so forth. Now, for me, just the fact that this organization exists shows a real commitment and need and desire for such clauses and terms that are necessary in order to achieve and indeed tackle the climate issues that we're facing. So just to get into a bit of detail, I thought I'd mention just a couple of them for you and then leave you with that web link there on the screen to go off and look at in more detail. But they are lovingly titled with first names. And just picking up on the first one here, we have Mary's clause, and that concerns building contract energy efficiency. And so it's an energy efficiency clause. It gives you amendments to the JCT design and build contract to make energy efficiency part of practical completion, so an obligation in order to achieve that. Its aim is at new and refurbished buildings so that they hit that desired efficiency requirement. And it does so by imposing a specific EPC obligation into the employer's requirements and requiring the contractor to achieve an EPC A rating in respect of the works or certain parts of the works in order to achieve practical completion. So that's Mary's clause. Then I've put up on the screen there Tristan's clause. That concerns construction materials and green procurement. And this one's interesting in that it introduces a formal carbon budget to incentivize industry participants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the use of more sustainable materials. So the carbon budget is sort of like a financial budget in a sense, and it means that the carbon dioxide equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions permitted for the construction of the works. It's set out in an appendix, a budget is established, and then if it's not achieved, there are liquidated damages payable if that budget is so exceeded. Obviously, these are draft clauses and can be amended to suit. And then finally there I've got Luna's clause, and that concerns green construction modifications. And this clause aims to incentivize contractors to propose green modifications, in other words, variations, to the works, which will benefit the project and the environment in the future. Those are a few of the construction ones I've pulled out. There are ones that relate to supplier-related clauses and issues. These might be useful. I won't go through these in detail, but if contractors and employers are going to sign up to particular objectives, particular targets that they need to reach, the supply chain, the value chain is going to be particularly important in achieving this. And subcontractors, subcontracts are going to need to be considered and taken into account. And I'd say watch this space. There's more to come. Hopefully in the pipeline, there's going to be modern methods of construction, NEC clauses, possibly further supply chain obligations. But it's a very interesting initiative. And if you're looking for some ideas, I'd highly recommend the Chancery Lane project. Now, I think you probably gathered there from what I was speaking about. We're talking about where are these obligations coming from? You're going to see them in specifications. They're going to relate to tendering, benchmarking, best practice. Watch out for termination clauses. Can you terminate for failure to achieve some of these obligations? And even perhaps the dispute resolution clauses. One of the draft clauses in the Chancery Lane project relates to what's a green arbitration. It's going to be dealing with travel, paper, minimizing waste. Indeed, lawyers will be hopefully going paperless in the future, dare I say. But one to specifically have sight of is requirements for businesses to identify their carbon footprint. And I think you've been hearing a lot about that recently. But what I did want to draw your attention to was some of the international standards that are available in this respect. I've just got some examples up there. On the left-hand side, there are organizational carbon footprint standards, and then you've got product carbon footprint standards. These come from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and you can find these available on their website. But these standards, they're providing requirements and guidance for companies and other organizations when you're preparing corporate level greenhouse gas emissions inventories and otherwise. And of course, and I've also put up there the ISO 14064. That relates to greenhouse gases. There's 3 parts to that, which obviously we're not going to go into detail today. Part 1 has to do at an organizational level. Part 2 is at a project level. And Part 3 provides guidance for the validation and verification of greenhouse gas assertions. Now, having just cantered through all of that, I think one thing that parties need to be aware of and alive to is greenwashing. What have you signed up to? Can you achieve what you promised? What do the standards and specifications that you are now obliged to commit to and deliver, what do they really mean? How are you going to be able to achieve that? And just by way of example, I have up there Client Earth versus BP. That was an action back in December of 2019, where Client Earth lawyers lodged a complaint against BP. BP's global, they had 2 ad campaigns called Keep Advancing and Possibilities Everywhere. And these ad campaigns, they were saying, misled the public by focusing on BP's low carbon energy products when more than 96% of BP's annual spend was on oil and gas. And I think this is just an example. It's setting a precedent for people in this particular instance to use the OECD guidelines to hold companies accountable for greenwashing on the basis of consumer interests, including advertising. So it's just an example of what are you signing up to? What statements are you putting out there to the public? And I think we're, potentially, are we going to see more challenges to come in situations, as I've said there, where companies make promises, sign up to specific obligations and contractual obligations. So these contractual obligations, we've been talking about measurement, monitoring, management, mitigation, predicting, all of these obligations within your contract. How are these going to be achieved? And this links me into the use of technology. Some of these obligations, I'll argue for today, I'm not sure that they can be achieved without the use of technology. And I think we're going to see such an increase in the options available. And therefore, we need to be alive to the technical and legal issues that surround it. So if you've been on our past webinars, you'll know that I'm wedded to this diagram, the McKinsey diagram, and I'm just going to pop it up here again because I don't know, it's our last webinar before a few weeks break, but it really does tie into the fact that when we're talking about technology and net zero, we really very much are talking about connected technologies and connected data, because we're talking about real-time flow of data, sensors. How do we understand what emissions we're talking about? How are we going to monitor, record all of these the carbon footprints and everything that's coming in to achieve these goals and these targets? So we're not just talking about one technology, we're talking about connected technologies. And the one I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes, I'm mindful of time, is digital twins. And because I think this really does bring to the forefront significance of technology in net zero and the importance of data and data management, which is going to be essential in achieving these targets. And the key difference here, and I, depending on your familiarity with digital twins, I won't delve into it too much, but we're not talking about static, siloed, two-dimensional drawings or documents anymore. We're not talking about data or design phases that are intermittently transferred and manually. But now we're into a real-time connection of models, data, databases. We have a physical asset, and that physical asset is linked to a virtual asset through the use of sensors, technology to predict, control, and monitor the actual physical asset. And I've put up there just a diagram which comes from the Construction Innovation Hub back in May, which really gives this flow of data around between the physical twin and the digital twin. Now, digital twins, what we're talking about here is comparative data and predictive analytics. And if we're going to achieve these targets, we need to know what the trend is for a particular asset. What's the analysis of these trends? Can we predict when something might fail? Can we then monitor and limit and tweak and change, and instead of sort of a more reactive approach? Now, what I think, are digital twins, are they alive and kicking? Well, they certainly have been for a while in the manufacturing industries and so forth, and we're seeing a real increase now of discussions around this. And where parties are going to be able to take this is certainly on the rise. Now, before I wrap up here, in terms of the legal issues around not just digital twins, but also other technology, drones that are being used to do inspections and monitoring, so forth, I've set out here some of the important things we need to think about across the board when it comes to technology. Liability, what have you signed up to do? What are the roles and responsibilities? Who's reliable for the performance of something or the outcome of something, be it the digital twin or otherwise. Now, when we're talking about net zero and other issues, we're talking about a lot of data here. So when you're capturing data, when you're hosting the data, issues around tolerance, accuracy, backups, service level agreements, security, these all come into play. And these sorts of issues need to be thought of at the outset. Which can be difficult with some innovation and some untested, untried areas. But one particular one to look out for is access to this data. Do you have the right to use this data, to access it? And issues of ownership and copyright and licensing all come into play here. And I won't go into information management and system integration, but clearly those can pretty challenging at times and need to be thought of. Now, just around the access to data point, access to this data, it needs to be considered throughout the course of the project and afterwards. As I said, do you have a right to access it? The common data environment, the platform, even in the event of non-payment, where is that common data environment going to be in 6 to 12 years' time when something goes wrong and you need to access it, and those sorts of issues. And of course, we've all heard of the case of Trent Engineering versus Mott MacDonald, which raised these sorts of issues that I'm speaking of here. And just one point on the right to use data and these databases, we do need to think of copyright issues and IP. If you're in a situation on a project where models are being created and generated, are these models, and I'm talking about BIM models and so forth here, are they going to be passed on to the client? Possibly they are not being required at the minute. Will they be in the future in relation to net zero obligations and being able to better visualize the building and starting to link data and data sets? Need to be alive to issues around copyright, objects that have been embedded. And there's a case there that I won't take you through right now, but that you might be interested in, that deals with some of these issues. The one thing I did want to say is that and this ties back into the contractual obligations that I was referring to before, what is it that you're signing up to? The more that we're defining and thinking about the deliverables at the end of the project and where you want to get to at the end of the project, the outcomes, needs to be thought about up at the outset so that it can be handed over, say, to the client or to whomever on completion. Because if we're thinking about the circular economy, the whole life cycle of a building and the asset, the data and databases and data sets are going to be essential particularly if we're talking about, in the context of building safety, the golden thread and those sorts that are also going to come into play here. So just to wrap up, I think the devil very much is in the detail. As I said, net zero, unprecedented, game-changing, and legislation, contractual obligations, and technology, and I've only spoken of just one or two bits here today, are going to be enabling this change, and we need to be alive to these issues going forward. So I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Stacy, and thank you everyone for all your questions and also comments. I mean, I was talking about the need to keep up to date with the court cases, and there's been very helpful comment in the chat about a recent French case from last month. The French top administrative French court condemned the government's failures to move forward quick enough in relation to climate legislation and gave them time 9 months to actually sort things out. So that's very interesting. And thank you very much for pointing that out. Ruth, perhaps we could start with you. We had a couple of questions in relation to conservation covenants and the biodiversity gain. But perhaps to take the conservation covenants first. I mean, why would parties use them? And what would happen if a covenant is breached during the project?
Thanks, Jeremy. So definitely I can see those kind of questions coming up for people who have a project and they're worried about how they're going to comply. So first on why would you use them? This is again the interesting point on how conservation covenants interplay with biodiversity. So you might have a problem where you have a project, you've worked out a biodiversity plan, but it's not actually going to be complete by the time of practical completion or the end of the project. Now, it's going to have to be secured as a future benefit if the planning authority are going to be able to sign it off. So that's a big thing that's going to happen, is people using conservation covenants to essentially demonstrate that they're going to comply with the biodiversity. And so that does mean that you could, in 10 years, 20, 30 years time, have fully complied with the biodiversity requirement, but you won't have done it straight away. Jeremy, I think the second question was what happens if you breach them in terms of what happens if you breach them. You will be brought to court or the upper tribunal, and lots of different things could happen. It might be possible that an injunction is taken against you. So if they know that you're not going to be able to comply, there might be an injunction. It also might sound in damages. And again, that's why it's so important to communicate down the contractual chain who's responsible, because it might be that a subcontractor does something. Ultimately, the contractor or the employer ends up getting a damages claim, and that's going to be passed down the line. So again, they're the kinds of cases I can see happening on that.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And the other one was about the biodiversity gain. How's that going to work? And I think related to that as well, and also perhaps the earlier point about the conservation covenants, is this going to affect when a project's actually completed?
So interesting question, Jeremy. In terms of how it's going to work, it all sounds really simple, and there's a paper from DEFRA where they say it's a really simple concept. In practice, I think not so simple a concept to actually carry out in practice. It's going to have to achieve a 10% biodiversity net gain, and in broad terms, you get that from subtracting the biodiversity loss that you have from the gain you have at the end. So that's the kind of rough calculation. And there's going to be a government tool that you can input all of these details in that will tell you effectively whether you've satisfied the requirements. In terms of this completion point, there's an understanding both in the bill and also in the policy documents that go with it that a habitat's full biodiversity value may increase years after the development is completed. So there's an acknowledgement of that. But if that's the case, certain conditions are going to have to be satisfied. So if it's on-site improvements, it's going to have to be secured through a planning condition or planning obligation or a conservation covenant. And the planning authority needs to consider the increase is significant in relation to the pre-development biodiversity value, and it's going to have to be maintained for a period of at least 30 years after the development. So again, this is where we're going to see it tying in terms of practical completion, and also who's going to manage the project after the practical completion stage as well.
Okay, no, that's really helpful, and I really do think that this question of when a project is completed is going to become an increasingly important one generally, and I think you might actually be seeing sort of changes to the way in which standard form contracts define practical completion or taking over. It's not just the environmental issues that you've been talking about. There's issues in relation to the UK government's soft landing plan, and also looking at the way and sort of tying this in with digital twins and just sort of monitoring the whole life of a project and the whole life of the building. I think we are going to see a number of changes to the way that we all traditionally view practical completion. And that's something that's going to be to look out for, I think, over the next few years or so. In terms of other questions, someone was asking about how we might manage, or how a company might manage the risks of greenwashing, which is something that sort of Stacy touched upon. I mean, it's also something that I'd been thinking about myself. To myself and Stacy have been discussing who was actually going to be who'd actually mentioned greenwashing. And I think the important thing really is to know what you or what your company, or I suppose perhaps even more specifically, your marketing team are actually saying. I mean, I think one of the difficulties here is that there's always a temptation to put out a statement or to run a campaign which suggests you've got rather better green credentials than you actually have when it comes to operating. I mean, if you think about it, if you're challenged on what you say you're doing, you've got to, is that actually different to what you're actually doing? When, from a net zero point of view, I think the key is not that a company is setting itself a target of net zero emissions by 2050, which is what we're all aiming for. But what matters is how that company realistically is going to achieve that. And if you think about it, and you think about what the government, for example, the construction minister is saying, you might end up being barred from government tender lists if the government's actually sort of true to their word. So I think the way to manage the risk is to be alive to what, and you know, it's very important what people say on behalf of a company. It's not just a greenwashing point. It's a general point. Just, you know, be aware what's, you know, do you know what's on your company website? You know, a question for everybody. But perhaps finally, Stacy, you went into an impressive amount of detail, and you were talking a lot about contracts and key contract terms. I mean, are there particular contract terms that should be inserted to encourage or manage risk using technology to achieve net zero? What are the key contract terms that we should be looking to insert, or we expect to see inserted?
In order to use technology? Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I say that because I think we need to be a bit mindful of the fast pace at which technology moves, right? So if we're defining, as I mentioned, I think earlier, if we're defining these outcomes and these deliverables and these targets that need to be achieved, and if we do it in a particular way, in my view, the technology will come, because if you need to define it, you will only be able to achieve it in some situations with technology. So I think we need to focus on that specifically. I think also, I mean, if you're talking about reporting and monitoring and all of that, technology, you know, will be there. I think it's kind of, I suppose one example is, you know, if you order in your contract, you ask for an iPhone 12, right? But you're not going to get that for another 5 years. In 5 years' time, you probably don't want an iPhone 12. You want an iPhone i20 or whatever it might be, right? So it's a fast pace. So I think we need to be alive to that. But at the same time, there are going to be situations where you do want to define it quite clearly in your contract terms. You know, maybe it's around modern methods of construction. Maybe it's around you know, drone footage databases that you do need at the outset on practical completion. So it does need to be thought about very carefully. And I think some of the Chancery Lane project clauses are going there to start to help to define those.
Okay, I mean, but yeah, so key there, I think, clarity, and that's a sort of key basic tool for contract drafting as a whole. Yeah. But Ruth, Stacy, thank you very much for sharing your detailed knowledge with us. Thank you all for being with us, and thank you all for the comments and questions that you have asked. We're interested in this topic, and we've inserted an additional question into the small questionnaire we ask you to fill in at the end of the webinar. See what topics you're specifically interested in in relation to net zero. It's funny, until I started organising these webinars, I was always slightly cynical of the questionnaires that follow a webinar or conference asking you to say what you're interested in, but it's actually really important to us because we want to know, you know, what interests you and what topics that you would like to hear about next year. So we'll be back on September the 16th, I think it is. So please save the date, and it may be that one of the topics that you're suggesting is something that we'll be starting off with in September. But thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the summer.